Well, it seems we've got a critical mass, so welcome everyone. I'm Jim Goldgeier. I'm a Robert Bosch Senior Visiting Fellow at Brookings and a Professor of International Relations at American University. And I also co-direct Bridging the Gap, which is supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York and the Frankel Family Foundation. Bridging the Gap provides training and support for scholars who want to engage beyond academia with public and policy audiences. And we're delighted to host this webinar on Dr. Rupal Mehta's book, Delaying Doomsday, The Politics of Nuclear Reversal, which appears in our Bridging the Gap book series with Oxford University Press. Dr. Mehta next month becomes an associate professor with tenure at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Upcoming BTG webinars include a session on August 25th on what to do if your research gets disrupted by COVID-19, and a book launch on September 22nd for Dave Barno and Nora Ben-Sahel's Adaptation Under Fire, which is the next book to appear in our book series. For this discussion, Catherine Urban will be monitoring questions for me from the audience, so you can submit those via the chat function. We will acknowledge you by name if we're able to address your question, unless you note that you would prefer to remain anonymous. And the conversation is being recorded and will be made available for viewing at the Bridging the Gap website. I've asked Dr. Mehta to open our discussion by telling us why she wrote the book and describing its main findings. And we'll then turn to our two discussants for their insights before we go on to the Q&A with our attendees. Debak Das is a MacArthur Nuclear Security Pre-Doctoral Fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. He's also a PhD candidate in political science in the Department of Government at Cornell University. And for his dissertation, he's examining how regional powers build their nuclear force structures. Dr. Scott Sagan is the Caroline S.G. Monroe Professor of Political Science, the Mimi and Peter Haas University Fellow in Undergraduate Education, and a Senior Fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation and the Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford. He also serves as Chairman of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Committee on International Security Studies. Among his many honors, Dr. Sagan has received the International Studies Association's Susan Strange Award, which recognizes a scholar whose singular intellect, assertiveness, and insight most challenge conventional wisdom and intellectual and organizational complacency in the international studies community. And he was also the recipient of the National Academy of Sciences William and Catherine Estes Award in 2015 for his work addressing the risks of nuclear weapons and the causes of nuclear proliferation. So I'm delighted that we have both Debak and Scott here to get the conversation going after the presentation. And Rupal, we will start with you. Congratulations again on your outstanding book. We're so delighted that it appears in our Bridging the Gap book series, and we look forward to your remarks to kick off this discussion.
Well, first of all, thank you all so much for joining us today. I know that there's a lot going on in the world, and I know that we're all facing an interesting and challenging fall semester or fall quarter. So I just wanted to take an opportunity just to thank everyone for joining our conversation today. I also really want to thank the Bridging the Gap community, who has been incredibly supportive of me and this book since day one. I really don't think I could have gotten anywhere with this project without the support of Jim and Bruce and Steve and many of the others in the Bridging the Gap community. So thank you all so much. And lastly, I wanted to mention, or I wanted to thank Scott, who has been my mentor for more than 12 years now. So I just wanted to take a moment to thank him. I think in the conversation today, some of the motivation for why I wrote this book and some of the implications from it, I think, stem from the time that I spent working with Scott at CSAC many, many moons ago. So I just wanted to thank him as well for his support of this book over the past 10 years. So thank you. I wrote this book, I think, for a few different reasons. One of which was I started graduate school in 2008, and that came on the heels of what was one of the most interesting summers or few months prior to that, when a few things happened. First was the release of the National Intelligence Estimate for Iran in 2007 that I think revealed some adaptive thinking or some amended thinking in what was going on with Iran's nuclear program. And this idea that there was a shorter time to breakout, I think, really cemented that Iran was heading down the nuclear path, and unless something was done to stop that. This also came on the heels of a Israeli strike or a military operation on a suspected Syrian nuclear facility in Deir el-Zor in 2007. And this again brought to the forefront some of the main questions that we had about what could be done to stop nuclear weapons programs, whether we needed to rely on coercive tactics, military threats, or the actual use of military force, economic sanctions, or other forms of policy levers. So as I began to sort of think about what I wanted to do for my dissertation and what I thought was some of the sort of interesting understudied or questions that still required a little bit more attention, this was sort of emerging at the same time that we were seeing some pretty key policy questions emerge in current events at the time. As I began to sort of walk down this path, I also started to look at some of the really canonical research that was done by Scott and Edel Solingen, Jacques Hymans, and others about why states had pursued nuclear weapons in the first place. And I think the parallel question about why they had stopped those programs was maybe built in as an implicit discussion, but had still not been explicitly explored, especially when we thought about the strategic interaction between those countries as proliferators and the international community writ large. So I wanted to sort of see if there was more to the story or what else was there to be discovered or to be explored in that question, and see if we could leverage some of that insight into exploring this other aspect of this sort of parallel question. And lastly, I think this was also at the time that we were seeing a renaissance or a resurgence in nuclear scholarship, some of which had been utilizing or leveraging growing data, growing large and quantitative and qualitative data that could potentially illuminate some new insights or some different insights from the past 75 years. And as part of my interest in pursuing this project, I really wanted to open up this sort of black box about nuclear decision making and figure out what tools had been most effective and why. And to do so, marshal some new data, some new empirical approaches, and to really sort of get a sense of what was going on sort of systematically over time. And in doing so, I actually had some really exciting implications or some findings emerge from this project. So I'll briefly discuss those, but I think there's others that come up whenever I think about this project or when I talk to different audiences, some new insights come up. And I think a few of them come up even when I'm thinking about sort of current events and the policy questions and the debates that we're facing currently. One of the key findings or one of the key implications that I think comes from this research is that this strategy really requires a collaborative and aggregated approach, not one that relies solely on isolated policy tools like sanctions or threats of military punishment or even the use of military force, but actually requires a combinative carrots and sticks approach to help coerce leaders to give up their nuclear programs. And in doing so, it gives them a political cover to save face and survive domestically, especially if they're facing resistance or opposition from political parties or from the domestic populace. But also, I think, to allow them the opportunity to sort of use that as a tool to stay in power and to save face reputationally. This, I think, runs counter to some of the more recent scholarship about the efficacy of economic sanctions in non-proliferation or the use of preventive military war against some types of proliferators. But I think it's actually more in line with what policymakers have had as sort of a general approach or sort of a general perspective on how to deal with proliferation. I was really fortunate to attend a Bridging the Gap seminar in 2019 on sanctions. And this workshop included policymakers, policy analysts, academics and scholars from think tanks and from academia. And one thing that was really salient in that conversation was this need for a strategic approach that combined both rewards and punishments to really effectively counter some threats, whether it was human rights violations, violation against international law, nuclear proliferation, or other things. And one of the sort of key, I think, realizations for me, and something that made me really happy because I had been talking about this in the book, was when a lot of the policymakers in the room from the National Security Council and elsewhere sort of highlighted the need for that type of strategic, tailored, but combined approach. I think one of the other key findings that emerged from that conversation, or this sort of implication on carrots and sticks, was to think more concretely outside the box about what carrots actually mean. I think in much of the scholarship, there's a sort of a reliance on carrots as money or security guarantees. But I think we can consider a broader set of rewards that include diplomatic dividends or access to technology, inclusion in the international community. And I think by allowing that further expansion of our operationalizations and definitions of rewards, and by collecting new data that gets at some of that nuance and some of that disaggregation, we actually start to see a few more interesting patterns emerge. One of the other key findings that came out of the book was the role that preventive military force or preventive military war can play in these discussions on counterproliferation. A lot of the existing scholarship by Debs and Montero, William Spaniel, and others articulate the value of military force. And my book does as well, but as a background threat that should really never be used. One of the key findings from the large N or empirical portion of the book is that when used on its own, it actually can make states more resolved to go and acquire nuclear weapons by continuing their programs after the initial sort of surprise and fallout, so to speak, of a military strike or an attack on a military facility. And some of the new work that I'm exploring with co-authors, including Michael Joseph and William Spaniel, starts to look at what happens when we relax those assumptions. If we don't have preventive military war as an option, what happens? If economic sanctions or preventive military war are actually that useful, and when and how in the process? So I think that this is an important question to examine further. And what I think my book highlights is that there's a time and a place for those threats, but never when used on their own. And lastly, I think one of the other key implications that emerged from looking at both the sort of large N data as well as some of the cases that I explored in depth on Iran and India and North Korea, and by using what I thought was some of the most interesting material that came from policymaker discussions that I conducted during interviews in Vienna in 2017, was that this strategy can actually work on even the toughest or most intransigent or resolved of proliferators. And I think one of the obstacles that we faced sort of analytically was trying to figure out if some of those tools were selectively employed against those rogue or tough proliferators and thus reveal that they didn't work. But my work actually, I think, can speak to that and try to mitigate those concerns and still identify a strategy and approach that can work on those types of proliferators. This is good news. I think this is one of the reasons why I'm generally optimistic, and I'm trying to sort of pull the hand back on our doomsday clock as in the cover. But it also, I think, is important to recognize that there are still going to be instances, I think North Korea is most reflective of this, where even my approach or this strategy won't work. I think that there's going to be moments in history where some of the assumptions that are built into these models, credibility being one of them, is going to lead to ultimately a failure of this approach. It's not to say that nuclear proliferation is a foregone conclusion, but it's just we need to be circumspect in how we believe that these strategies will actually operate. Lastly, I think one of the key implications from this research is about that credibility assumption. I think today, now more than ever, we're really dealing with the idea that our actions and our words are not seen as credible by either adversaries or allies. And I think the past half decade or so has really highlighted this for all sorts of states, including Iran, but also North Korea, allies like Germany, Japan, South Korea. And the questions that emerge from that about whether or not our commitments to provide security, to maintain security guarantees, to stop nuclear proliferation, whether our agreements to settle some of these issues can even be seen as legitimate, I think will really raise some important and critical questions about the efficacy of this approach and the efficacy of counterproliferation strategy moving forward. I think I'm still generally optimistic, which is strange. I'm actually a relatively cynical person by nature. But I think that there's still a fair bit of work to do to undo some of this damage and to undo some of the concerns that have emerged over the past years. But ultimately, I think that we do have a chance. And unlike some of the really pessimistic perceptions or predictions about what the world would look like now, from President John F. Kennedy to even scholars like Kenneth Waltz, it sort of predicted that there would be this massive wave of nuclear proliferation and we would have far more nuclear states than we do, I think that this book and the research that I've been able to do sort of highlights why that has not yet happened. And fingers crossed, we can actually keep that going without encouraging another wave of proliferation in the coming decades. So I'll stop there, and I'm really looking forward to hearing thoughts from both Scott and Debak and everyone else in the group. Thank you again.
Great, thank you so much, Rupal. And as I mentioned, I'm going to turn to Debak and then to Scott, and then open it up. And since we're doing this as a Zoom meeting, I mean, if you want, you can post your question in the chat, and I'll ask it. But given we have a manageable group here, we could, if you also just want to highlight that you do have a question and you would like to ask it yourself, we can go ahead and have you do that. But Debak, let's turn to you next.
Right. Thank you so much, Jim and Rupal and Bridging the Gap for having me here and giving me the opportunity to read this excellent book. I really enjoyed reading it. It's crisp, it's succinct, it's very rich, not only just empirically, but also just with the ideas, which just my compliments first. So, so just coming back, I think the mixed methods setup is great. And despite all the data limitations, sort of bringing in qualitative evidence to make the argument, it all makes for a very, very interesting and exciting read. So positive inducements are primarily responsible for nuclear reversal is, I think, a very important argument, and that negative inducements have little or no impact on nuclear reversal is especially important for us to understand, given the conversation about non-proliferation and counter-proliferation that we are having today. So don't just offer carrots to your allies, but also offer them to your enemies if you want to see a positive nuclear outcome. And I think that's really the main takeaway for me from this book. What I also like about the book is that it's not just another book where here's the theory and here are all the cases that fit. What Rupal does is she discusses like the difficult and hard cases for the theory, especially with the India case, especially with the Iran case, where you have reversal, you have the JCPOA, you may have like some sort of reversal of the JCPOA. So I like that, you know, the empirical record is very, very thoroughly gone through, and it's not just, you know, here's everything that fits. So that's a model that, at least as a graduate student, I strive to. So what remains are questions and at best quibbles. So I'm going to have a sort of organize my arguments around four broad points. The first one is a question that I really have about covert action, which is, what about covert attempts at counterproliferation? In this theory, if sanctions and threats of counterproliferation have to go together, then are there ways of signaling resolve through low-scale covert operations, or would they have to be, all sorts of threats have to be explicit in order for the strategy of nuclear reversal to work? So that's the first question. The second discussion point for me is the international community. And I think the book often mentions that the United States or other members of the international community, and that really makes you wonder, what are the counterproliferation tools from other members of the international community without the United States? Would this picture hold? And this is also a counterfactual question in some ways, because I thought back to the 2019 international security article by Eliza George, which argues that, you know, during the Cold War, you had superpower states, the US and the Soviet Union, playing the role of thwarters. And that piece sort of talks about an interactive effect between the US and the Soviet Union as market regulators, as thwarters of the sale of ENR technologies. So I'm curious as to whether you find any form of interactive effect and whether we can actually think of an international community which is there without just the US driving it. And especially any evidence for the Soviet Union's role is something that I was very curious about, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on. All right, so the next question I have is with regard to the United States' intention. And I think that, your work really raises an interesting question of how genuine are the US's intentions if the United States is so important in this larger story of counterproliferation and nuclear reversal? Are the international community and the United States always aligned necessarily on policy and principles? And one can point to the Pakistan case here, and Rabia Akhtar has a great book which is evocatively titled The Blind Eye, and it discusses how US presidents from Ford, Carter, Reagan, and Clinton all knowingly look the other way as Pakistan is proliferating. And the US sometimes even helps this proliferation process. Case in point is the fact that they sold Pakistan F-16s, which is one of their means of nuclear delivery. So that's really the second point, which is how genuine can we assume that the United States is necessarily good faith actor in non-proliferation / counter-proliferation world. The third case is, and this is an area of substantive interest for me, so I'm going to talk a little bit about India, mostly because I enjoy doing it, but also I enjoyed reading your chapter on India as well. All right, so I would actually argue that India falls in a different quadrant, which is a low resolve and large policy distance category, because in some ways, in the 50s and 60s, India may not necessarily represent being an ally for the United States. For the Indians, at least, once the US signs the Mutual Defense Act with Pakistan in 1954, and then Pakistan joined SEATO and CENTO, and 1971, when the United States sort of tilts towards Pakistan in the India-Pakistan war, for India, it turns to the Soviet Union. It has the Indo-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, which leads to a considerable amount of policy distance from the United States. And so I'm wondering if the Indian case then could potentially fall in a different quadrant in your 2x2. Also because in some ways, if the US was serious about non-proliferation in the 60s, especially when you had the negotiations for the NPT taking place in the 18-nation Disarmament Committee, the non-alignment movement being led by India were going to the US. And you mentioned that in the chapter as well, that India was looking for security guarantees. And I was very curious as to why is it that if giving security guarantees would mean that India and the non-alignment movement countries would sign the treaty, why didn't they do it? So I'm wondering if there's any evidence for that. And I thought that was a very fascinating discussion about the security guarantees, because it seemed like they were so close, but it didn't really happen. And again, in 1998, once India does the test, it's a surprise to the US, but in some ways to the rest of the international community, I wouldn't think so, because in 1974, in that sense, isn't really a peaceful nuclear explosion as much as India wants to call it that. Every NATO document, for example, that I've seen, especially the French documents, all assume that India can manufacture a nuclear weapon in about 6 months to a year, and French government documents actually just call India a member of the nuclear club. They've got no ambiguity there. And again, in 95, 96, the US picks up the Indian preparations for the tests, and even though Narasimha Rao agrees to not do the test once the US puts pressure, in 98, of course, the test happens, and the BJP comes and claims credit for doing the test and using nuclear weapons for a whole set of muscular Hindu right-wing propaganda. But in reality, this entire program was there from 1948 onwards. And so I'm wondering if we can actually say that 1974 to 98 is a period that US efforts at counterproliferation were successful with regard to India, especially given that relationship. So just a couple of final questions in terms of implications for policy, and especially because this is bridging the gap. So the first is, at what point can we say, what point do you give up counterproliferation and nuclear reversal as a strategy and just accept nuclear weapons states for being so. Because you talk about India, you've talked about Pakistan, and you've got the case study about North Korea. And I'm wondering, well, this does seem like it falls in that category of fait accompli, where they have nuclear weapons, and we are already talking about nuclear deterrence with regard to North Korea. And if that is the case, then at what point does the US or the international community, for that matter, stop calling it counter-proliferation and nuclear reversal and maybe categorize it as something else? And that would, of course, require some amount of policy work. And finally, can history, given where we are today, actually provide a roadmap for navigating, or even for the US to lead the non-proliferation / counter-proliferation effort? So can past necessarily be prologue, given the kind of madness in the arms control and non-proliferation world that we are in today? But all that said, thank you very much for what was a great read. I highly recommend this book. I really enjoyed reading it, and it sparked so many questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Debak. Scott, over to you.
Well, let me start by saying it gives me both personal pleasure and intellectual pleasure to be joining you today. Personal pleasure because, as some of you may not know, Rupal Mehta was my research assistant between her undergraduate career and starting her graduate program. But what very few of you know is that my very first research assistant when I was a postdoc at Harvard was Jim Goldgeier, between his undergraduate career and his going to Berkeley for his PhD. So I feel like I'm seeing some super successful research assistants of mine here today, which is really a joy. It's an intellectual pleasure because Rupal has written a very smart book, chock full of important insights. And for those of you who know her, that's not a surprise, because she's a very smart person who has lots of interesting ideas. My view on the main theme here is that what she has as a subtitle in one of the chapters is this is about negotiating in the shadow of force. What kinds of negotiation tactics and carrots and sticks can work, but she is quite clear on page 32 in particular that a credible threat is a necessary but not sufficient factor involved in successful reversal of a nuclear program, and that the other necessary, but again not sufficient by itself, is that there has to be some kind of reward. Minimally, this is seen as a face-saving gesture, a ability to let a new government leadership change claim victory or have a political cover. But possibly it could be something more than that. It could be some kind of security guarantee, something more, but it's a range of things that could go in there. Now, what's not clear to me, and what I want Rupal to try to explain, is the relationship between those two major factors. And I ask this because I think that you are very optimistic in this paper, and your inherent optimism, despite claiming a few minutes ago that you have a cynical heart, your optimism comes out sometimes, and it's not clear to me how much you really believe that view. So let me give two cases that I learned a lot from, but I'm still not clear what your view is about why they failed, and that's China and North Korea. So the China case study is really very well done. But at one point you begin by saying that the military intervention for the United States was, quotes, clearly not an option. And on page 125, it was deemed too costly. But then you end with a very optimistic view, which is that, perhaps it could have gone the other way. Perhaps history could have had a very different solution. You say, it is conceivable, though impossible to test, that if President Kennedy or President Johnson had followed through on suggestions from analysts and policymakers in the administration to establish a China counter-proliferation strategy that privileged both the use of positive and negative inducements, things might have turned out differently. So the optimism side is saying that, had we actually followed your advice, we could have gotten China perhaps not to ever have developed the bomb. But then the pessimism side says, well, the threat of credible use of military force wasn't there. And I want you to try to explain which it is. That same tension comes out in the North Korea case, because at times you say that the US threat of a preventive attack is not credible. But it seems to me that part of the negotiations going up to and entering into the Clinton administration's policies leading to the agreed framework were precisely because, at least from the North Korean perspective, it was credible that we might use military force in a much more limited way, not a full-scale invasion, but a limited attack. Today, however, it's not clear. One view would be that what's happened is that in 2016, 2017, the Trump administration made credible threats, albeit pretty loud and often boisterous, to use military force, and that while not reversing the entire nuclear program, it got North Korea to stop testing ICBMs and testing nuclear weapons. That's one interpretation. The other interpretation, which you seem to take, is that we've given way too much to North Korea, and that we are now turning from non-proliferation to deterrence. Again, I can't tell whether you're optimistic or pessimistic about this. I don't think that you're taking the full John Bolton position on North Korea. At the same time, if your theory is right, unless there is a credible threat of a preventive attack of some sort, we aren't going to get any reversal other than the testing ban. So I just want to hear Rupal talk more about both China and North Korea, and convince me that I should be more optimistic than I am. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks so much. Well, Rupal, we've got a number of questions you already have from our two discussants, and you can answer whichever you want, but I did find, was hopeful that you would address three of the points that have been raised. One was the question about the role of covert action as a counter-proliferation strategy. The other was Debak's question as to whether 74 to 98 is a successful, you consider to be successful counter-proliferation strategy. And then Scott has raised this question about the link between threats and rewards in the North Korean and Chinese cases. And so would love to hear any thoughts you have about those three issues or anything else that's come up.
Thank you. Well, these were all wonderful questions, and kudos to Debak for being able to get through a relatively challenging Q&A part for you. So thank you again for these questions. I'll start in the order in which they were posed, and hopefully it'll spark some other conversations and some other thoughts as well. So this idea of covert action, you know, I see Mike Poznanski's here, and so you're going to get to read his fantastic book on covert action, and I'll probably do a disservice by not having something as intelligent to say about it as he does. But I think you're absolutely right that there is this this question that emerges about whether or not these threats and these signals have to be done explicitly or implicitly, or whether they can be sort of ambiguous or not attributed by the United States or other actors. I think this was most salient when we talked about the purported United States' use of a covert cyber tool against the Iranian program through the Stuxnet use. And I think one of the limitations that I think most of us have as scholars is that we're only really privy to the publicly discussed signals and reactions. And so I had a chance to speak to some of the Iranian consular officers and some of the diplomats that were in the JCPOA negotiations. But when I sort of asked them and sort of pushed them on this question, you know, they were relatively reticent. That was one of the only times where I got a little bit of pushback on having a conversation about this. my sense is that most of what we're picking up on, and again, I'm looking at this mostly historically, is we're looking at the overt symbols, things that are done out in the open, whether or not they're press statements or speeches, tweets, that are sort of revealing the use of these tools. And what I'm picking up on in my data is things that were done and then I sort of have recorded from the historical record. I think that there is going to be a much bigger role for some of the sort of covert operations or actions that you're describing, especially if, and this is where Mike's work and others who are studying covert action, that I think is going to be more salient here. But I think especially if that is signaling something that can't be done publicly. If the US is using some of these covert tools to signal either a willingness to negotiate or a stronger resolve or an intense dislike for the proliferator in question, and is reticent to do that sort of in a public setting, but is willing to undertake some of these more covert actions, I think we might start to see what that looks like sort of on the dependent variable side. But this was a little outside the purview of my work, only because we haven't seen as much of this happen so far. I sort of suspect that we're going to see a lot more of this, especially as we start to uncover countries that are interested in acquiring nuclear latency, and then how we were to potentially use covert action or use some of these covert signals to stop those attempts. I just want to briefly talk about this question of the international community, and then I'll talk about India, China, and North Korea. Yeah, this really, okay, sorry, I had my headphones are just disconnected for a second, but hopefully they are working now. This question about the international community came up a lot, in part because when I first started the project, I was really eager to talk about that as sort of a distinct unit. And then as I got further into some of the data and further into the cases, I realized that they actually operate not as a monolith at all. And you sort of bring this up when we talk about the interactive effect of the United States and the USSR as market regulators or working in collaboration to stop proliferation. But then you also have China often as a thwarter or as a spoiler state, right? And you have the France and the United Kingdom working alongside Japanese partners or other European partners, sort of without the United States there, just try to get some traction on these questions. I think one of the key findings from the book, and one of the things I've been thinking a lot about, is what happens now. I think we're going to start to see the international community take a much bigger role and in these negotiations or in these strategies, in part because there's going to be a sort of a genuine lack of leadership from the United States, especially with regard to these questions. And so while it wasn't as much of an issue from the sort of 1945 to 2010 era, I think we're going to start to see it become a much bigger actor and a much bigger player as we move forward. India. I should have realized that with you guys, especially with you and Scott, that this was going to come up and I should have been better prepared. No, this is a fabulous question, and one that I struggled a lot with. And Jim, if he remembers from the reviews, this was something that the reviewers mentioned as well, because India is such a unique case, and in some ways the biggest challenge for me in my theory, in part because I sort of have this relatively neat divide between allies and adversaries. And India sort of falls in this weird middle ground where it's neither. So I had to think a lot about this sort of neutral state and what that meant, but not just in terms of its formal alliance relationships, but also in terms of what this meant for the divergence in preferences, what this meant for how the United States had historically reacted to countries like this. So if I could sum up the sort of questions that emerged from this conversation, it's sort of, I think a couple of really important questions came out. One was, why didn't the United States just sort of go forward and provide the security guarantees that the Indians wanted? And the result of that would have been potentially no proliferation in India and potentially no proliferation in Pakistan. Those would have been really big wins for the US. And then I think the second question that emerges from this is, is this 1974 to 1998 period really evidence for the theory? So the first question, I struggled with this in part because this book wasn't looking into US intentions, right? It was mostly looking at the interaction and kind of black boxing what was going on internally in the United States. And I did that for a couple of reasons. One is that it felt like it was too much to take on in one book, and it's actually probably going to be something I pursue in future. But also because I just had a hard time getting a lot of data on this. From my reading of the data, and again, I defer to you guys because you're definitely the experts on this case. From my reading of the data, there was just a lack of political will in the United States to go that far. There was the motivation of keeping Pakistan as at least an erstwhile ally, trying not to upset the Pakistanis, especially when it came to working with them in a variety of different contexts about the Cold War and then the global war on terror later on. But it was just sort of, if we put a stake in the ground and we absolutely ally with the United States and provide with the Indians and provide a security guarantee, it sort of closes any opportunity to ever sort of manage both India and Pakistan simultaneously, which I think was their goal, even though I think the United States did not do a very good job of that during this era. I think that there was also just a sense of feeling overwhelmed by the commitments that the US had already had at that time, and going through this experience with the South Koreans and the Taiwanese in different contexts. I think there was just a lack of political will to take on yet another country for whom the US was providing security to avoid proliferation. And then the second question that emerged from this case is about whether or not I can really consider 1974 to 1998 a success. Scott was there for my book manuscript workshop, so I think we had a lot of discussions about this there as well. And I think one of the reasons that I do consider it at least a success for the most part was because we saw sort of the efficacy of this threat and reward strategy, and then we saw like a slowing, at least, of public information or sort of publicly available evidence that the Indians were pursuing nuclear weapons. Now, you and I have talked in other contexts about this data and some of the new data that you've uncovered from the archives about how at least our prior understandings of some of the dates and some of the times for this stuff may need to be updated a little bit, Debak. But I think that I think from what we've been able to tell so far, there is a market slowing down, and I think that reflects one of the sort of nuances of my dependent variable. One of the nuances of the outcomes that I examine is may not be, giving up a full weapons program. It may not be dismantling a weapons program, but it's a tangible slowing of nuclear development. And I think to some degree, Indira Gandhi really did put a sort of full pause on this, at least while she was in office, until, sort of things started to evolve on the backside. I think from the United States' perspective, they probably do consider this a win and something that they sort of pat themselves on the shoulder for. Although I think 1998 was to them, it was a sort of big surprise and a big shock that strategy had not worked. Scott, your two fantastic questions. Yes, I think there is a huge tension between my optimistic side and my pessimistic side. I think you're also picking up, especially with North Korea, what was a really like a tenuous and challenging process of constantly updating the chapter in the current time to sort of reflect what was going on with the Trump administration in North Korea. And at some point, I just sort of had to stop. My editor said, like, you can't keep updating this every single day with new tweets or new policies or what's happening in the news. So, just sort of focus on what the sort of the crux of the issue is and what you've been able to discern so far. So with China, I thought a lot about this, especially because this question's about the US and the Soviet Union's relationship with regard to China, and now the US and the Russian relationship with regard to anything. Iran, North Korea has come up a lot. I definitely am not a Chinese expert nor a Soviet expert. I know that I'm sitting here with one of the most preeminent ones. So I think what I'll say, or at least what I think is what was sort of driving this discussion in the book and what I think is going on, is that, yeah, U.S. Willingness to use military force on its own without Soviet assistance, I think, was a real obstacle to even considering military force. And in the book, I lay out what I think are 4 or 5 different conditions under which military force can't work. And in some cases or some instances, especially if you're talking about a proliferator that's an ally or a friend of the United States or has relatively low resolve, you don't need military force, right? It's not it can be insufficient, or it doesn't have to be fully necessary in the sense it's really hard to imagine us issuing threats of military force against Australia or Sweden. But I think in the Chinese case, it was reflective of a lack of resolve that I think has sort of carried through today. And if that had gone the other way, if the United States had either been willing to expend political capital to convince the Soviets to join them, or had been willing to go on their own to issue those threats of military force, and hoping that they wouldn't have to actually go and act on them, I think it could have gone the other way. Now, why the threat of military force wasn't there? I mean, this was a really just genuinely tough time for the United States in terms of non-proliferation, and sort of been dealing with blow after blow after blow from to the non-proliferation regime. So I'm optimistic in the sense that I think the theory can help explain why that case ended up the way it did, but I am generally pessimistic that there are going to be instances in which we don't have the political will, we don't have the political capital or the resolve to go and enact some of those policies that would have led to different outcomes.
Yeah, I would just add, if I could, Rupal, I would just add that there are two other things happening besides the Russian refusal to cooperate with the United States on a potential preventive strike against the Chinese test site. One is Vietnam. So
Right.
we did not want to get involved in another conflict at the time.
Right.
And the second, it's important to recognize that the Chinese test comes in October 1964. What else is happening in October 1964? There's an election campaign going on. And Lyndon Johnson is running as the moderate against who? Barry Goldwater, running as the hawk, I'm going to use military force. It's right around that time that Goldwater is surreptitiously is criticized with that very famous wordless advertisement that Johnson has of a girl picking daisies, and then an atomic bomb goes off in the background. And that's saying, don't vote for Goldwater because he's going to get us involved in a war. So I think domestic politics and the war were really important in constraining American military options against China.
I think that's absolutely right. And there's actually a wonderful new book coming out soon by Rachel Whitlark that's exploring some of those questions as well on the Chinese nuclear program and some of the sort of precursors, especially domestically, about why the US didn't pursue the strategy that potentially could have stopped the Chinese from acquiring nuclear weapons. And then sort of wrap up, I think we are observing the same tension in North Korea today, which is there's similarly some reasons why both in the 1990s and since then, our strategy has not been particularly effective. One is that I don't think that my read of the data, my read of the evidence is that the few plans that the United States has had for a military operation in North Korea were seen to be both non-credible to the Americans and to allies generally, even though the North Koreans were worried that that was a potential option. And I think that that might just be a reflection on the opacity of the North Korean decision-making process, bluffing or misrepresentation by the North Koreans, or even the opacity of our own military operations process. And so my sense is that from both the time during the agreed framework and the lead up to the agreed framework conversations, there's some really interesting insights from former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry about how he had tried to put together some plans, and the moment that President Clinton saw them, he immediately realized that this was absolutely a non-starter and they could not pursue it, both because of the effects on North Korean population, but also because of the effects on the South Korean alliance and other sort of regional issues. I think that the threats that were done, that were issued in 2016 and 2017, I mean, I would not at all presume to be an expert on what's going on inside the Trump administration or what's going on in terms of President Trump's resolve or sort of credibility. I guess my read on it is that there's just so much noise. And so it's really hard for any adversary or any actor to read through that noise and figure out what the signal is. Those threats were then immediately followed up by letters of love and summits. And so I think if you're North Korea or really anyone, it's incredibly difficult to discern the sort of flip-flopping nature of the policy and the program to figure out, well, what is the sort of inference I should make about the United States? And from an analytical standpoint, it's been incredibly difficult to figure out what the inferences we should make about that order of events and what the sort of correlative patterns of behavior have been from the North Korean perspective. To sort of address this last question that I think came up a couple different times is, should we start turning from non-proliferation to deterrence? I mean, I think in almost all these cases, we sort of do both simultaneously. I think there is always an option in any case where a new leader might come to power that has wildly different preferences than their predecessors. There might be new opportunities. There could be new contexts in which approaching a state to pursue nuclear reversal or counterproliferation is now more viable or more tenable. And so then we sort of have in the back of our head that strategy and sort of keep thinking about what types of carrots and rewards can be used, while also making sure that if a country does acquire nuclear weapons, that they do so in a safe manner, that it's well regulated, it's well monitored, and that we are trying to achieve some deterrence so that nuclear use is off the table. And I think for the North Koreans, that might be what we have to do in the time and for the time being, until either that there's a change in regime or there's something else that happens domestically in the North Korean context that allows for the opportunity for negotiation. But at least for right now, I think we need to be focused on, signaling clearly what our intentions and our goals are, and then trying to get the North Koreans to act as responsibly as possible. And that itself seems to be quite a challenge. So thank you again for all these questions. And I look forward to those from the audience.
Great, thanks. Well, Rupal, since you mentioned Mike Poznansky's work, I invited him to come in if he wished, and he said he wished. So we'll turn to him now. And again, others can put any comments or questions in the chat or raise your hand and use the raise the hand function. Mike.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Rupal, first, congrats on a really impressive accomplishment. I'm very pleased. It's really wonderful to see it out. Yeah, I think you raised a lot of interesting questions, and there are a lot of interesting questions about covert action as a possible substitute for overt military force in the service of reversal. And here I was kind of thinking about Austin Carson and Karen Yarhimilo's work on covert signaling. And, they identify that in some cases, covert action can be an effective signal of resolve. I don't know if anybody's applied that specifically to the case of nuclear reversal, and it would be really, really interesting. And just a few smaller points, the case of Stuxnet, I think it's an interesting topic to ask, what signal, if any, was being sent implicitly or explicitly? Was it that the US is averse to incurring costs? Is it that the US just wanted to prevent Israel from conducting a preventive strike? Maybe was it just the beginning of an escalatory ladder? I don't know the answer to that. And then finally, it's also worth thinking about in the realm of covert action. A lot of these cases, Stuxnet and the cyber attacks against North Korea's program, probably aren't meant to send any signal at all, at least not directly, because the US is seeking deniability just to kind of sabotage programs. Now, of course, if states learn that the United States was the perpetrator, they can infer all sorts of things about US resolve and cost tolerance and so forth. But that would be different from communicating, even privately to the potential proliferator that, you're willing to carry out a covert attack against them. So super interesting questions, lots of, as you could tell, lots of fruitful areas to go based on your book, which is great.
Do I have a moment to just respond to that, or should we?
Yeah, go ahead. And then there's a question from Noel. So I'll ask that after you respond to Mike.
Yeah, Mike, this is awesome. And I'm hoping that somebody, hint, maybe you and I can work on something together that explores this. Yeah, I think, again, I'm not in the minds of what's going on in Stratcom or in the Defense Department, but I think that maybe all of these things are sort of working simultaneously. It might be reflective of the US being averse to cost or just being sort of smarter about the second and third order effects of what would happen if it was a strike on a military facility using bombs rather than a strike on a military facility using a cyber weapon. It also could be sort of a display about the sort of portfolio of tools that the US has, and maybe something that is meant to signal to other countries that are interested that, we have the ability to even get to Iran. So this is something that you should be mindful of before you start down this path. And then I think this was also, this is also coming at a time when the United States is really trying to figure out what its red lines are with regard to military action on a variety of different issues. And so it might have been something that they were willing to do to signal their resolve, but didn't, have the same degree of costs as it would have been if they had sent boots on the ground or other, sort of military actions at that time. And we still, I think, I can't remember now if we have a definitive answer on whether or not the United States has claimed responsibility for this. It sort of goes back and forth, but I believe it has. And so I think it'll be interesting to see what other countries or what other sort of perspectives about the use of this type of covert cyber tool on nuclear issues will have to say in the future. So yeah, cool and very fruitful ideas moving forward.
Great, thanks. So there's a question from Noel. So Rupal, the question is, your book highlights that achieving a state's commitment to nuclear reversal is an aggregated effort. On a related policy theme, your book implies that some partners may be better than others. How should or should not the United States, as a tentative leader in the non-proliferation regime, seek partners to achieve this critical goal?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think that there's been instances where having partners has been incredibly helpful. My sense is that the US would have been at a loss, or it would have had a much bigger challenge in approaching Iran and sort of managing that negotiation, if not for the Europeans and if not for even Oman. Oman played this really interesting and sort of secret role or clandestine role in trying to bridge the United States and the Iranians during the lead up to the JPOA and the JCPOA. I think as we move forward, it's almost as though the question might be reversed, which was, all the other sort of states or all the other major powers are gathering together to challenge proliferation and sort of establish a strengthened non-proliferation regime. Will they come to the US to be a partner in that? My sense is that it'll take some time to sort of manage the damage that's been done to the non-proliferation regime by some of the rhetoric that's come out over the past few years. And that, especially with regard to the JCPOA and trying to sort of resurrect that, if the Europeans take the lead on this, which it seems like they might be trying to do, then whether or not they'll come to the US as a partner is still unclear. Assuming, however, that we have a change in leadership that in the United States that is interested in pursuing non-proliferation and counter-proliferation, I think it's been demonstrated pretty clearly that even though the United States is the one primarily offering the carrots and sticks, is the one sort of leading the charge, it only has the ability to do so when it has friends and partners by its side. And the wider the range in that, the better. Having the Russians and the Chinese, even sort of in spirit, if not in action, can be very helpful to get the rest of the international community on board, especially when it comes to things like third-party sanctions or international or United Nations sanctions or resolutions that are meant to sort of temper or stop proliferation. But great question. Thank you.
I have a question that I would like that all three of you can answer if you wish. And maybe particularly Scott, since it was sparked by your question about these cases of China and North Korea. So when we first got Rupal's manuscript in, I was totally blown away by her account of the number of cases where states had embarked down the path of a nuclear weapons program and then stopped. I mean, I guess I should have known or should have, but the sheer number and array was quite astounding to me. And her point that, in the vast majority of these cases where states have gone down this path, they have not gone forward with, completing their nuclear weapons program, or they've changed course. And, it includes cases, includes the cases of the former Soviet states that inherited nuclear weapons, but also, that are pretty well known, South Africa. states like Brazil and Argentina, but also, you know, Egypt and Algeria and Sweden. You know, we focus on, rightly, we tend to be taken by the, you know, a case like North Korea where we have failed to stop this program and it has gone forward, and now they've got nuclear weapons. And as you said earlier, we're in a deterrent relationship. But just curious your thoughts on, as we think about sort of theory building, what sort of the mix between focusing on the cases where not only are they hard, but the theory may have some trouble explaining them, as opposed to a whole set of other cases that we tend not to think about very much, but that are important for us to understand as we think about the balance between states that in fact where we do see a reversal versus states that do go forward. And I just, you know, any of the three of you, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Maybe Rupal can go first. I've got some comments, but I'd like to hear, this is her show, I'd like to hear her comments first.
Yeah, I mean, Jim, I had the same gut reaction as did David Lake, actually, when I first told him that the numbers were in my favor, especially when it came to the central limit theorem and whether or not I'd be able to do anything statistically with the data. I think there's a lot of really interesting and rich nuance. And I spent one summer, actually, I was sort of visiting at CSAC for just a summer, and I got to spend that entire sort of 2-month period just going through each of the cases and picking up some of the patterns and seeing some of the relationships that I think are there when you really get into the details and you start to look at when states sign treaties and at what point that they start to develop components of the nuclear fuel cycle, and at what point that they start to interact with the US to gain sensitive nuclear assistance or other forms of technology that's necessary to build nuclear weapons. And I think for me, there is a lot of really interesting nuance and really interesting insights that come from looking at these sort of separate categories or different categories of states. There's another excellent book that's coming out by Paige Cohn that actually takes on 3 additional countries, which I don't look at, the Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Belarus cases that were part of the Soviet Union and then sort of were left or inherited nuclear weapons programs, and then walk through the reversal process in each of those countries. And I think that again reflects some really interesting nuance and what the universe has looked like and what the different approaches and sort of manifestations of this have been over time. I think for me, there's a few that almost never get any attention. I'd love to do more work on the Australia case. I think that's one of the sort of ones that stands out as something that we can spend a little bit more time on. Some of them are much better traversed, like Iraq and Libya. Malfred Hadhammer has done a ton of terrific work on those cases. But I think that the nuance that we're all sort of genuinely surprised at is probably great fodder for new dissertations and new research by a bunch of different scholars coming out. So.
Yeah, I just want to make 2 points on this. One, I like you, Jim, get very impressed when you look at table 1.1 of Rupal's book, in which she shows that nuclear reversal occurred in 23 out of 32 cases. And so there is a reason for you to be overall optimistic, even if your pessimism comes out with the North Korean and the Chinese failures of non-proliferation. Secondly, I just want to note that there's a big difference between states starting a program and reversing it before the NPT comes into place and their behavior afterwards. And here I think domestic politics is absolutely crucial. Democracies and non-democracies alike have built nuclear weapons. Democracies and non-democracies alike have started programs and then reversed them. But since the NPT has come into existence, only non-democracies have cheated on their agreements, and sometimes reversed and sometimes not, in the case of North Korea. And in particular, in all of those cases, I believe, depending on how you measure personalist dictators, that these were personalist regimes, not just regular autocratic regimes, but personalist regimes, and whether that's because they didn't think they would get caught, or because they didn't fear they faced audience costs if they got caught and had anyway, I don't know, but I think that's another area that I think is ripe for more research.
Great. I don't know, Debak, if you had anything, and then there's a question from Paige.
Right. I just wanted to. So I was blown away by Table 1.1 as well, and so every book I read, I have like a fun fact section. And my fun fact for this was I had no idea that Spain had a nuclear program under General Franco, and I was just blown away by that. And I went and looked up, and anyway, it was a rabbit hole, but it was it's so interesting, this list. But I think that the NPT question is definitely an important one of what are the effects afterwards, and who are the countries which actually don't sign by 1970. And then eventually in the next couple of decades, because of the dynamics that Rupal's pointing out, with individual states leading to sorts of nuclear reversal versus you've got multilateral groupings of countries, or just the Soviet Union telling some of its allies to conduct reversal by offering extended deterrence. I think those are all very, very interesting dynamics, which we've definitely got to get together and like do more work on these 32 cases.
Great, thanks. So Rupal, the question from Paige, two questions actually. First of all, I would love to hear how you made your decisions in regard to measuring inducements. What is considered a positive, negative? Does the order they are given matter? And two, what do you think are the next big issues in the non-proliferation field for scholars to tackle?
Wow, those are fantastic questions and big ones. So I'll do my best, but then I'd love to hear from Scott and Debak and others about some of the other big questions in the nuclear studies non-proliferation. This question about inducements, both in terms of how I conceived of rewards and sanctions, and then sort of a question about order or succession. Yeah, these were really key questions that came up a few different times, and that at least for a couple of them I struggled with a lot. One was, especially if we think about removing a sanction, or if a reward has to be taken away because a state does not comply with the agreement, sort of how do we think about those things? I'm in good company to be somewhat surprised and confused by that. Tom Schelling had some of the same questions as well about how we conceive of rewards and sanctions, especially if they're imposed and then withdrawn. And I think for me, I started to look at this from both the sort of analytical perspective, but also the policy perspective. Analytically, it was a little bit more clear that if a sanction was issued, I didn't think about its removal as a particular reward, in part because most other proliferators and academics and scholars didn't. And I asked this question to policymakers at the sanctions workshop in 2019, whether or not they thought of the removal of sanctions as a potential reward. And the answer I got, I think, was really important and helped me figure out how to navigate this, which was most of the time we actually don't see the removal of sanctions happen immediately. That process is really challenging and difficult and long-standing, and especially when it comes to financial sanctions being lifted, or the movement of money or assets between sanctioned individuals. Some of those decisions are made by individual firms or companies or banks, and almost always it's a long and tenuous process that, when lifted, most of the sort of targets of sanctions rarely conceive of those as rewards. And especially when it came to the case of Iran, with the JCPOA and the sort of lifting of the embargo and many of the other sort of restrictions on financial assets or movement of targeted individuals, as soon as it became more apparent that a potential Trump administration would either get rid of the JCPOA or reintroduce sanctions, or otherwise sort of complicate the actual process of implementing the JCPOA, many of the financial institutions and other firms sort of stopped or slowed the process because they were worried that they would have to redo it if the Trump administration came to power and withdrew from the deal. And some of that came to be true. So for many of the targets, they actually don't see the lifting of a negative inducement as a positive inducement. So I wanted to sort of conceive of those as separate things. And then when it came to the order, I mean, this is where, you know, much of the large end data can't get to this question, in part because we don't always see these things happening with such granularity that it's month or day by day sort of accounting. But that's where a lot of the qualitative data can give us a better sense of what's going on. The Iran case, again, I think is really helpful for this. We saw the sort of use of economic sanctions by many US presidents sort of leading up to the negotiations for the Joint Plan of Action and the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And it was the sanctions that sort of brought the Iranians to the table, but then it was the use of rewards, specifically allowing them to keep some access to civilian nuclear technology, and it was some of the other sort of monetary and financial rewards that were used together. And so it can be the case in which you have to sort of use sanctions first to bring about a negotiation or bring about the bargain, and then use the rewards to sort of seal the deal. But some of the other cases reflect a slightly different ordering. To get to the second question about what are some of the understudy or questions to be discussed moving forward, one of the big ones that comes to my mind is, you know, exploring how the US makes these decisions. I think traditionally we've seen that foreign policy from administration to administration has been somewhat consistent. Obviously, there are many policies in which partisanship or party ID matter in shifting some of the policies and matter explicitly when it comes to foreign policy. But we've never seen such a big divide between a predecessor and a party when it comes to the Trump administration. And for me, you know, it's not to sort of pick on the administration, but it's just to reflect that there needs to be a much more theorizing about how domestic politics in the United States and the role that political systems, institutions, the military, parties, spoilers can play in how we develop and implement foreign policy. So that's one of the big questions that I think is sort of needs to be explored. Another question that I think is interesting, and I'm starting to do a little bit of work on myself, is what the next wave of proliferation is going to look like. It may not be nuclear weapons. It might be other forms of disruptive, you know, weapons of mass disruption that are changing the landscape that we see today, whether it's cyber weapons or the use of unmanned aerial vehicles or other sorts of tools that are starting to really enter into the battlefield landscape, but we haven't done as much theorizing on, in part because their uses are either less frequent or it's harder to get a sense of what's happening because they're not used as clearly or as unambiguously as other forms or other weapons. So I think exploring the role of emerging technologies and then identifying if there needs to be opportunities for regulation, management, and monitoring. So another big set of questions that I think are going to come up in the near future. I'll stop here, but I'd love to hear Scott and Debak's responses as well.
Well, great. And since we don't have any other questions right now, I turn to Debak and Scott to see if they have anything they'd like to say about this or any of the other issues that have come up, and then we'll go back to Rupal for any closing thoughts that she might have. Debak, go ahead.
Thanks, Jim. So yeah, I have a couple of thoughts on where the what I find at least interesting in where the literature can go, but also just from this book, I had this pinned down, and Rupal spoke a little bit about this. I was wondering about leadership change in the United States. You know, you've got this new leader window when it comes to proliferating countries. And my question was, what about the US? Well, is there a new leader window on the enforcer side? And, you know, party ID could be one way of understanding how the approach of the United States changes. But another question is, do new proliferators try and push the envelope every time you have a leadership change in the United States or on the enforcer side? So that's something I think that comes directly out of this. Of course, another idea for a sequel to your book is reversing reversal, which is, you know, you can have another person pulling this the other way, and 2016 to 2020. Hopefully just 2020. But yeah, but in terms of other big questions, I think in the nuclear world, I think one is the idea of the international history, which is to sort of step back from the US-centric work and the US's role. And I think it's gotten its fair share of research, but there's now archives opening up all over the world. You know, greater democratization of like post 30-year rule sort of things happening. And you've got the UK, France, India, some of these places I've been to and looked at the archives. There's such a lot of material out there, and there's such interesting connections which between regional powers themselves, without just looking at the US or the Soviet Union, and they're interacting with each other in these cycles of proliferation on very sensitive technologies. And so with that sort of data now coming to the fore, I think that's also right. There's a lot of research there, right, to be done. And finally, I think public opinion work, which I think Scott's doing some path-breaking work there, but there's also, again, so much work to do in terms of, what are the domestic politics costs for proliferators when it comes to nuclear reversal? What does that mean for domestic audience versus international audience? And how do you negotiate those things in the context of nuclear reversal and nuclear proliferation? So there's lots of very interesting and exciting avenues there, definitely.
Great. Scott?
I'll mention three. One, Debak already teed me up on public opinion and domestic politics regarding nuclear weapons use and potential nuclear weapons proliferation for other countries. I think the work that Ben Valentino and I did in the article called Revisiting Hiroshima and Iran has sparked a lot of controversy, and I think that's good. Alex Montgomery and Charlie Carpenter have a debate with Ben and with me in the fall issue of International Security about the effects of law on public opinion. And Alan Weiner from the Stanford Law School, Katie McKinney, my research assistant, and I have a piece in the current issue of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists called Why the Atomic Attack on Hiroshima Would Be Illegal Today. So I think questions about law and public opinion and the lead opinion, I think are a very important issue to be studying. And also, what's it like in other countries? Our work is almost exclusively on the US. Unina Dill and I have been doing some work on other countries, but I think there's a whole area of research that needs to be done. Second, I think that there would be very useful work to be done on the question of the relationship between nuclear power and nuclear proliferation. Can we have the spread of nuclear power without having the spread of nuclear weapons proliferation? There's been a lot of work done on latency, but it's going to be a moving target as we figure out new countries are seeking to acquire capabilities. Think about Turkey and Saudi Arabia. What does this mean, and what kind of constraints other than the NPT could be put in place? And third, I think despite the article by Lupu and Furman a number of years back, we still know relatively little about how the NPT really works. We all assume that this has a big impact, and my comment earlier about personalist dictators cheating on it. I think that's really an area rich for research, because no one, as far as I know, has really studied the patterns of joining the NPT. Who does it when and why, and how is that related to their exploring or not exploring? To what degree does the technology constrain versus to what degree, or does the IAEA constrain versus to what degree does the IAEA encourage by giving certain technologies or certain knowledge? So that's still an area that's, I think, ripe for more research.
Great. Well, this has been incredibly rich. Rupal, before I close it out, any last thoughts?
No, I just wanted to thank both Scott and Debak and Jim and the Bridging the Gap group again, and all of you for joining us today. I know there's a lot happening in the world. I'm sure there's been some very interesting developments even when we've been here in this past hour and a half. So thank you all for joining me today. And I hope that everyone has a safe and healthy remainder of their summer and start to the new semester and quarter and the academic year. So thank you again.
Well, it's been great to have this discussion with you, Rupal. We're really so proud to be able to have this book in our series, and look forward to your continued success, and grateful to Debak and Scott for joining us with such insightful comments. And one of the things we're hoping for from these webinars is that as professors are looking for material for their students to watch this fall in the online classes, that they can make use of these kinds of discussions. And I think that will be the case with this one for sure. And also just even the last few minutes of discussion of big topics, I hope that professors will, with their PhD students, mull these over, sending out the next generation of scholars of non-proliferation. So thanks very much to all of you, and thanks to Catherine for not only getting us organized, but also managing us through what turned out to be a little bit of an unruly session today, but she took care of it, and really appreciate her watching this and managing it, and wish you all a great rest of your day, and please all stay safe.
Thank you.